They said it was just an old blanket. They laughed as their dog chewed the edges, dragged it through the mud, and tore at the stitching my great-grandmother once hand-sewed. But I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Because I already knew what they left unguarded in the attic, and when I put that up for auction, suddenly the laughter stopped. I've always believed that some things are sacred. Not because they're expensive. Not because they shine or glitter or impress the neighbors. But because they carry stories. Threads of memory. That quilt was one of those things. It was made by my great-grandmother during the Great Depression, each patch cut from the clothes her children outgrew, hand-stitched under candlelight. She passed it to my mother. My mother passed it to me. And I kept it folded in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed like it was made of gold. Then my son and his wife moved in. Not because they had to, but because they saw opportunity. My house, quiet, spacious, and paid off, became their playground. It's just for a while, they said. Until we save for our own place. I didn't mind at first. I even liked the company. I cooked meals, kept the sheets clean, stayed out of their way. But it didn't take long for guests to become rulers. They rearranged the living room. They set schedules without asking. And slowly, the rooms that once belonged to me started feeling like someone else's home. One day, I walked into the den and found my son's wife vacuuming. That's fine, of course. Until I saw what she'd moved aside, my cedar chest. The lid was cracked open, and the quilt was gone. I asked gently, "Have you seen the patchwork quilt that was in here?" She looked over her shoulder, not even pausing the vacuum. "Oh, that ratty old thing? Yeah, I gave it to Max. Max is their dog. A slobbery, untrained golden retriever who thinks everything is a chew toy." My throat tightened. "You gave it to the dog?" She shrugged. "It looked like trash. I figured it was just clutter." Trash. Clutter. Something sewn by the hands of my great-grandmother during nights she went without food just to keep her children warm, now ripped apart by a dog because my daughter-in-law didn't bother to ask what it meant. I walked outside, sat on the porch, and stared into the yard. Max was rolling in the grass, quilt trailing behind him like a cape. He had already shredded one corner, the tiny embroidered initials, MEL, for Margaret Elaine Lawson, barely visible in the slobbery fabric. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't argue either. What was the point? To them, I was just the quiet old lady with too many memories and not enough boundaries. But I started looking around the house differently. They had filled the walls with their taste. Expensive wall art, modern statues, digital photo frames. They insisted on remodeling the upstairs guest room, turned it into a yoga studio with candles and crystals and books they never opened. One item, though, always had its own special place, a glass display case tucked in the corner of the dining room, under its own spotlight. Inside it sat a signed first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, her father's, apparently. Something her family had passed down for decades. She told me once, if the house ever caught fire, I'd grab this before anything else. Funny how things change when you live under someone else's roof. That's when the idea planted itself in my mind. Quiet. Steady. Patient. The same way you mend a torn hem, stitch by stitch. The next morning, they went out for their usual weekend brunch. I waited until the front door clicked shut, then walked into the dining room. I opened the case, took the book out gently with gloved hands, and wrapped it in tissue. Then I packed it in a secure shipping box and drove straight to the small-town antique auctioneer's office 2 towns over, the one with the monthly private collector event. I used my maiden name when I signed the form. Told them it was time to let go of things. I didn't set a reserve price. I knew what it was worth. Back at home, my daughter-in-law didn't even notice it was gone. Not that night. Not the next day. She only glanced at the empty display case with a tilted head. Weird. I thought I put it somewhere else. Then she went back to scrolling on her phone. They didn't realize. Not until the auction flyer arrived in the mail. A full-page glossy announcement. Rare first edition of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird up for private bid. Collector's gem. And my name listed beneath it, my full maiden name, followed by a phone number for interested buyers. I left it on the kitchen counter. That evening, when they returned from whatever overpriced meal they'd gone out to eat, I was sitting calmly at the dining table with a cup of tea. The mail lay unopened beside me, except for that one flyer, placed face up, perfectly aligned. I didn't have to say a word. She saw it. She picked it up. She read it. And then she screamed. My son rushed in. What's going on? She's selling my father's book. The one from the case. That's theft. It's theft. I took a long sip of tea. No, dear. It was in my house. In my display cabinet. And unlike my heirloom quilt, I didn't let the dog chew it up. My son opened his mouth, then closed it. Because even he couldn't deny the truth in that. They called me cruel. They called me heartless. They called me spiteful. But you know what? They never once called me wrong. And that was only the beginning. They thought I'd back down. After the screaming, the insults, the stomping up the stairs and slamming doors, they thought guilt would settle in. That I'd feel ashamed. That I'd call the auctioneer and cancel the listing. But I'd felt shame already. I felt it when I saw the muddy corner of that quilt clutched in that dog's teeth. I felt it when the two of them walked past me that evening, chatting about renovations like I didn't exist. Shame had already come and gone. What was left now was clarity. And clarity doesn't flinch. That night, I made myself a grilled cheese and tomato soup, just like I used to make when my son was a boy and he had a bad day at school. I sat in the quiet kitchen, lights low, and listened to them upstairs. Doors opening and closing. Voices raised. Her voice, mostly. It's her way of getting back at me. Maybe don't give her family heirlooms to the dog, my son snapped back. I smiled at the soup. At least one thing still had flavor in this house. The next morning, they tried a new tactic, pretending nothing happened. She came down in her robe, poured herself a green smoothie, and said, I thought we could all have brunch on the patio today. A little family reset. I looked at her and saw right through the silk robe, the fake smile, the over-applied eye cream. I said, sounds lovely, and brought out the good china. The china she once told her friend looked outdated and depressingly floral. She blinked. You're using that? I thought I'd bring some of my own history to the table today, I said with a small smile. The food arrived, delivered of course, from some trendy organic cafe, and we sat out back in the shade. It was a beautiful day, blue sky, a soft breeze, the smell of roses in bloom. They tried to be sweet, almost too sweet. Every compliment dripped with tension. I love how green the lawn is, she said. I love how peaceful this neighborhood is, he added. I just nodded and took bites of my overpriced avocado toast, counting down the days until the auction. 3 days. Then 2. Then 1. They must have seen the updated flyer online. Because the night before the auction, they called a family meeting. That was code for an ambush. I walked into the living room and found them sitting stiffly on the couch, back straight, arms crossed. The bookcase display was still empty. That hollow space behind the glass, the same space they never noticed when my quilt went missing, now looked like a missing child poster to them. We've been thinking, she began, smoothing down her blouse, and we realized that book was important to both of us. It's not just mine. It's family. And it was never yours to sell. I sat in the armchair across from them. Calm. Still. I didn't even blink. I said, do you remember the story behind that quilt you gave to the dog? She rolled her eyes. Oh my God, is this about the quilt again? My son touched her arm. Let her speak. So I did. I told them about Margaret Elaine Lawson. About the thimble she wore every day until her fingers blistered. About the dresses she cut up and repurposed when they couldn't afford fabric. About the initials stitched in the corner. And now, I said quietly, it's shredded. Ruined. Gone. He shifted uncomfortably. She looked away. That book? It's in perfect condition. You kept it polished, protected, locked in a display case. You honored it. Funny how we all protect what matters to us. Silence filled the room like fog. Then she snapped, it's not the same thing. I raised an eyebrow. Isn't it? My son stood up. Okay. Let's just calm down. Mom, how much are they offering you at this auction? Maybe we can match it. Buy it back. Keep it in the family. I looked at him and felt a deep ache that only mothers know, the kind that starts in your chest and tightens all the way to your fingertips. It's not about the money, I said. It's about respect. He sighed. But you're making a statement. Yes, I replied. Finally. That night, I slept like a baby. The morning of the auction, I got dressed in my best navy blouse and slacks, tied my silver-gray bobbed hair back with a clip, and put on my mother's gold earrings. Simple, elegant, unapologetically old. As I drove to the auction house, I passed our little downtown, the bakery where I used to take my grandson for cupcakes when he was 4, the park where I taught him how to ride a bike. I remembered his little hands gripping the handlebars. The way he looked up at me, eyes wide and trusting. That little boy was gone. At the auction, the book drew attention instantly. Collectors circled, eyes gleaming, flipping through with gloves and reverence. I watched from the back of the room, arms folded. When the final bid closed, $146,000, the gavel struck, and the room applauded softly. It was gone. Forever. On the way home, I stopped by a vintage shop and bought myself a beautiful, handmade quilt. Not to replace what was lost, nothing could. But to remind me that not all things from the past are meant to be discarded. When I got back, I laid it over the back of the living room sofa. My son noticed first. New quilt. Yes, I said. Some things deserve to be appreciated. That evening, they didn't speak to me. That was fine. Because I was finally done speaking to them. But I wasn't done altogether. No. There was one more thing they hadn't considered. One final gift I'd been holding in silence, hidden in the filing cabinet at the back of the closet. The house deed. The living trust. And the recent changes I made to both. There's something my daughter-in-law never bothered to ask. For all the time she spent renovating this house, rearranging furniture I had already arranged with care, replacing heirloom dishes with sleek white plates from catalogs. Not once did she ask whose name was actually on the deed. She assumed. Assumed that because they lived here now, it belonged to them. She assumed that because I didn't bark back when they barked orders, or because I cooked for the holidays and stayed quiet while they made jokes about my hoarder corner and old lady clutter, that I didn't have power. But silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, silence is preparation. And I had been preparing for years. It started the day I found her opening my jewelry box, saying she was just curious about what might be passed down one day. The way she held up my mother's locket between 2 fingers like it was some cheap trinket. That was the day I decided to move the real valuables. And a few months later, I rewrote my trust. Not out of spite, not then. Back then, I did it for protection. Because I'd seen the way she looked at money. Not like something to build with. But like something to show off. To wield. So I created boundaries they didn't even know existed. Now, as I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, flipping through the newly notarized trust and title documents, I finally understood that what I had written in calm preparation was now my shield. And my sword. The house was in my name, solely. And in the updated trust, my estate would pass to a non-profit for women artisans. I had added a note too, handwritten, folded in the folder, let something beautiful come from the ashes of disrespect. They didn't know that yet. But they would soon. That night at dinner, we barely spoke. My daughter-in-law sliced her grilled salmon with robotic precision. My son kept glancing at me like he wasn't sure whether to be afraid or apologetic. They were expecting something. Maybe for me to say sorry. Maybe to rescind the auction, even though the book was already gone. Maybe to beg for harmony. But I had nothing left to beg for. Instead, I said, I have something to share tomorrow. I'd like us all in the living room after breakfast. She rolled her eyes. If this is about that quilt again. My son stopped her. We'll be there. I went to bed early. Slept well. When morning came, I made fresh coffee. Wore a pale rose cardigan over my cream blouse. Slacks pressed. Hair neat. Gold clip in place. I looked the way I always did when I had something important to say. When they shuffled in, groggy and still in pajamas, I stood beside the fireplace. Before I say anything, I began, I want to show you something. I held up a photograph. Black and white. Worn edges. This is Margaret Elaine Lawson. My great-grandmother. She sewed the quilt you gave to your dog. I handed it to them. Watched them squint like it was a homework assignment they didn't want to do. She raised 6 children in a 1-bedroom farmhouse. Lost her husband to illness. Taught every one of her daughters to stitch not just for beauty, but for survival. I paused, then pulled another item from the folder. The original quilt sketch, folded and yellowed. She mapped every square before sewing. That quilt wasn't just warmth. It was history. A survival story. And now it's shredded. My daughter-in-law scoffed. Are we really doing this again? Yes, I said firmly, folding the papers. Because what you did was a symbol. You took something sacred and treated it like garbage. And that, more than the act, is what I can't forgive. They looked at each other. My son opened his mouth, but I raised a hand. One more thing. I laid the trust folder on the coffee table and opened it slowly. This house, I said, is mine. Solely mine. It always has been. Silence. I've let you live here for years without rent. Without question. I cooked. I cleaned. I backed off when you told me I was too controlling about decor or too emotional about objects you didn't understand. I looked directly at her. But this isn't just a house. This is my legacy. And I'm done pretending I don't see how little that means to you. My son stood up slowly. Mom. I turned to him, and my voice softened just for a second. You used to sit on my lap in that rocker by the window. You'd beg me to read you Goodnight Moon 3 times in a row. You cried when you thought the moon was lonely. You were kind, gentle, thoughtful. Tears burned in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. What happened to that little boy? He didn't answer. But I saw it, the flicker in his eyes. Shame. She didn't show it. Are you kicking us out? She asked, arms crossed, eyebrows raised like she was daring me. I smiled. No, I said. You're going to do that all by yourselves. I picked up the second envelope and handed it over. Inside was a letter from a realtor, my realtor, offering a quote and a buyer interested in the property as is. A very good offer. I've decided to sell. Her jaw dropped. You're selling the house? Yes, I said. And I've already accepted the offer. You have 30 days to find another place to live. My son sat down heavily on the couch. Hands in his hair. Mom, where are you going? I gave him a small, knowing smile. Back to where things are appreciated. I had already signed a lease on a small cottage in a retirement artist community, where patchwork quilting was not just respected, but revered. Where weekly sewing circles were therapy and legacy wrapped into one. I'll be surrounded by people who understand that just because something's old, doesn't mean it's worthless. My daughter-in-law stood up, her face red. You're punishing us over a stupid blanket? No, I said calmly. I'm reclaiming my dignity. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room. They didn't follow. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the sun begin to dip low over the trees, casting long golden light through the living room. The same room where I once sang lullabies to a boy who promised to always be my protector. I'd mourned that loss already. Now, I was finally ready to move on. And I still had one final surprise to leave them, something small, but powerful. Because revenge isn't just fire. Sometimes, it's silence. Sometimes, it's memory. Sometimes, it's what you leave behind. And what you take with you. It's funny how fast people change when the floor beneath them starts to crack. After I told them about the sale of the house, the mood flipped. Suddenly, the same daughter-in-law who called my sewing dust collectors was complimenting my choice in fabric patterns. My son, who hadn't sat beside me on the couch in years, was now asking how I slept at night and if I wanted help with my tea. But I wasn't fooled. I'd spent too many years giving them the benefit of the doubt. Too many nights alone in that kitchen while they laughed in their bedroom. Too many birthdays passed over with a gift card or worse, a regifted item still in last year's wrapping paper. This wasn't guilt. It was panic. They didn't love me. They loved the house, the garden, the proximity to downtown, the fact that they didn't pay rent. But love? Love doesn't laugh when you cry over a quilt. Love doesn't throw family history to the dog. Still, I played nice. Because the best kind of revenge doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it smiles while the wheels keep turning behind the eyes. I let them believe they could talk me out of it. Let them think the papers weren't signed. I even agreed to dinner that Friday night, one last family gathering, they called it. What they didn't know was that I had already packed my most precious belongings and sent them ahead to the artist community where my new life was waiting. I'd even reserved my new spot at the Sunday quilting circle. But Friday? Friday was mine. So I dressed for the occasion. Sky blue blouse, my best pearl earrings, and the pale yellow cardigan I always wore to special church events. I tied my silver hair into a low chignon and stepped into the dining room like I was about to host royalty. And in a way, I was. My own self-worth. The only royalty I'd ever needed. The table was set. Wine glasses gleamed. My daughter-in-law had pulled out the fancy dishes, the ones that used to be mine. I took my seat, folded my napkin in my lap, and waited. "Mom," my son started nervously, "we've been thinking a lot about what you said." "Oh. Yes," my daughter-in-law chimed in, her voice syrupy. "We had no idea how much that quilt meant to you. Honestly, we feel awful." I raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" She nodded, placing her hand on mine like we were dear friends. "It's just, we didn't grow up with those kinds of traditions, you know? But we want to understand you better. We want to do better." I gently slid my hand back to my lap. "That's thoughtful of you." Then they dropped the real reason for the dinner. "We were wondering," she said carefully, "if maybe, there's a way you'd consider staying? You don't have to sell the house. We can start paying rent. Or, maybe we figure out some kind of co-ownership." Ah, there it was. The offer of shared control over something I built from the ground up. Control. Not connection. I took a sip of my wine and smiled softly. "I appreciate that. But I've already committed to the buyer. And to myself." They tried again. "But we could renovate the upstairs for you. Make it more comfortable. You could have your own entrance. And your own quilt room," my son added quickly. I chuckled. "A quilt room? After all this?" They didn't laugh. I folded my napkin carefully, then looked up. "Let me tell you both a story." They leaned in, hopeful. I began. "When I was 28, I was broke. Your father and I had nothing but a beat-up pickup and a baby. I worked 2 jobs, and I quilted at night to keep my hands from trembling from the stress. One of those quilts was that heirloom. I stitched in the dark, by lamplight. My fingers bled. But every stitch reminded me that I was still building something." I paused. Let the silence sit heavy. "That quilt survived a house fire, a flood, a move across 3 states. And in one afternoon, you gave it to a Labrador to chew on." "I didn't know," she snapped, suddenly defensive. "It was just a blanket." I stood up, calmly. "No. It was never just a blanket." I walked to the sideboard, pulled out an envelope, and set it on the table. Inside? A photo of the quilt, or what was left of it, shredded in the backyard grass, dog slobber staining the fabric. Beneath it was the auction certificate for the rare book I'd sold. Along with a note from the buyer, this was my grandmother's favorite story. "Thank you for trusting me with it." And below that, the donation confirmation. I hadn't kept the money. I donated every cent to the Margaret Lawson Textile Scholarship Fund, a new non-profit I'd set up in my great-grandmother's name. Their eyes widened. "You gave it away?" my son asked, stunned. "That book was worth $25,000, I finished for him. "Yes. And I gave it to women who understand the value of thread and memory." My daughter-in-law looked like she'd swallowed vinegar. "But you could have helped us." I stepped closer. Why would I help people who see history as clutter and kindness as weakness? They had no answer. So I gave them one. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm not here to fight. But you're not entitled to what I built just because you share my blood or married into it. Respect is not inherited. It's earned." I took a breath. "And you haven't earned it." Then I turned and walked away from the table, the very table they once made me feel invisible at. In the hallway, I paused by the coat rack, slipped on my shawl, picked up the small bag I'd packed for the night. My ride, a dear friend from the Quilting Guild, waited in the driveway. I didn't look back. Because the most powerful exit is the one they don't see coming. That night, I stepped into my new cottage. Cozy. Warm. A single armchair beside a window. A work table already prepped for my next project. And on the wall, above the mantel, hung a framed photo of my great-grandmother's quilt, printed from one of the few surviving photos before it was destroyed. Not to mourn, but to remember what I came from. I wasn't just stitching fabric anymore. I was stitching a new life. A quiet one. A proud one. And most importantly, a life where I didn't have to prove myself to anyone who didn't care to learn. Because when you're finally surrounded by people who see you, who value what you carry, you don't need to scream. You just need to start again. And let the silence speak for you. You'd think that after everything, they would leave me alone. But pride, especially wounded pride, has a way of dragging people back into your life even when you've made it clear you've closed the door. It started with a knock. Then another. And another. Every week for a month, my son or his wife would show up outside my new cottage, clutching some store-bought pie or half-hearted apology in a gift bag. I didn't answer. I'd stand just behind the curtain, watching their silhouettes shift in confusion, irritation, then defeat. It wasn't cruelty. It was protection. Because when someone shows you repeatedly that they only value you when they think they can benefit, you stop giving them the tools to hurt you. One morning, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. I almost didn't listen to it, but I recognized the number. My son. His voice trembled on the recording, not from sadness, but from frustration. You're being unreasonable, Mom. You embarrassed us. You made us look bad in front of everyone. You think people don't talk? You think they're not laughing at us for losing the house? For what you did with that quilt and the book. You should have kept this in the family. That was our legacy too. I played it twice. Then I deleted it. Legacy? They didn't want legacy. They wanted ownership. Over my work. Over my home. Over me. But I had already learned that lesson. And now, I was busy building a legacy of my own choosing. At the community quilting studio, things were blooming. The moment I'd stepped through those doors weeks ago, I knew I'd found something real. The studio was filled with color bolts of fabric lining the walls, soft music playing in the background, and the gentle hum of sewing machines filling the air. But more than that, it was filled with women like me. Some had been cast aside. Some had escaped painful marriages. Some just needed a place to be seen again. And together, we stitched more than quilts. We stitched healing. I started teaching weekly workshops, threads of memory we called it. I shared techniques, yes, but also stories. Laughter. History. And one afternoon, as I pulled out a new piece I'd been working on, a woman across from me gasped. That design, she whispered, pointing to the swirling pattern of florals and vines. It looks like my grandmother's quilt. The one that was lost in a flood when I was 12. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition, grief, awe. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't just about my quilt anymore. It was about all of ours. The ones that got destroyed, dismissed, or thrown to the dog. So I made a decision. I wasn't just going to rebuild. I was going to honor. That week, I partnered with the director of the center to launch a new program, Reclaimed Threads, a storytelling quilt project where women brought in pieces from their lives and wove them into community quilts that would be displayed across libraries, galleries, and community halls. It was a hit. People donated old wedding dresses, baby clothes, even scraps from uniforms worn during World War II. And with every stitch, we stitched ourselves back together. Word spread. By mid-month, a local news station reached out for a feature. They wanted to interview me, the quilted legacy lady, as they called me in their email subject line. At first, I hesitated. But then I remembered that voicemail. The one where my son said I embarrassed them. Good. Maybe it was time I embarrassed them just a little more. The news segment aired on a Sunday morning, just after the church broadcasts. The anchor stood beside me, smiling brightly, as she introduced the story of an ordinary woman turning fabric into community. They filmed inside the studio. They panned over the wall where I had hung a photograph of the destroyed quilt with a plaque beneath it, in memory of what was dismissed, and what rose in its place. And then during the interview, I was asked the question that changed everything. Why do you think people respond so emotionally to quilts? I looked into the camera, straight-backed and steady. Because quilts aren't just blankets, I said. They are maps. Of who we were, what we endured, and what we carry forward. You can laugh at them, tear them, throw them to the dogs, but the story? The story survives. And if we're lucky, we get to write the ending ourselves. The anchor's eyes glistened. So did mine. And apparently, so did a few thousand viewers. The feature went viral. The Quilting Center's inbox exploded. Requests for workshops came in from 3 neighboring states. A local museum offered us an exhibit slot for reclaimed threads. Donations poured in. But more importantly, letters came. From people. Women and men. Saying, "I never knew how much my grandmother's old quilt meant until I watched your story. I cried watching you speak. You reminded me of what I'd forgotten mattered. Thank you. You made me pick up a needle again." And tucked between those letters? One from someone I hadn't heard from in years. My sister. We'd grown distant after a family dispute years ago, another story for another day. But she wrote, "You always had a way of turning pain into something beautiful. I'm sorry I forgot that. I'd like to visit your studio sometime. Maybe we can stitch something together again, not just fabric. Us." I clutched that letter to my chest and cried. Because for every person who threw something sacred to the floor, there was someone else willing to pick up a needle and help stitch it back. The next week, as I was helping a young girl hand-stitch a heart into her memory quilt, I heard the bell over the studio door ring. I turned. There, in a stiff suit that didn't quite match the occasion, stood my son. His eyes darted around the studio, visibly uncomfortable. A few women turned to look, whispering. He walked over slowly, holding something in a large, soft-wrapped bundle. "Mom," he said. I saw the interview." I nodded. "I didn't come to fight. I came to return something." He placed the bundle on the table. I hesitated, then gently unwrapped the fabric. Inside were pieces of the destroyed quilt. Cleaned. Pressed. Torn edges still visible, but cared for. Almost reverently folded. "We found these in a storage bin behind the garage," he said quietly. "I thought you might. I don't know. Maybe you could use them for something." I looked up, tears stinging my eyes. "I already did," I whispered. "But thank you for bringing them back." He looked relieved. Then unsure. "I didn't understand what it meant to you," he added. "No," I said gently. "You didn't want to." He nodded, accepting it. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I didn't say, 'I forgive you.' Because forgiveness isn't always instant. But I said, 'Thank you.' And sometimes, that's the beginning of a new thread." That night, I stayed late in the studio. The pieces of my heirloom quilt lay spread across my table, illuminated by soft lamplight. I didn't cry this time. Instead, I began stitching. Not to restore what was, but to make something entirely new. A phoenix from fabric. A story reborn. One that didn't pretend the past didn't happen. One that said, "I see it. I survived it. I stitched it anyway." And that was the most beautiful piece I'd ever make. People say closure comes in time. But sometimes, closure comes with a needle in your hand, soft light pouring across your work table, and no one interrupting your silence anymore. It's been 5 months since the auction. 5 months since I took back the story that was always mine. I didn't plan for things to unfold this way, certainly not for a local gallery to commission a solo exhibit of my quilts, or for a publishing house to reach out and ask for a book of my designs paired with the stories behind them. But when you stop waiting for others to value you, something strange happens. The world starts paying attention. The studio has become more than just a space for stitches and seams. It's now a community hub. We've hosted intergenerational quilting sessions, grief therapy circles, even patch and poetry nights where teenagers sew while reading spoken word. And every time I stand up to teach, there's a soft awe that settles in my chest. Not because I'm famous, but because I'm finally seen. There's a difference. One morning, while stitching a tribute piece, a tapestry built from donated fabrics symbolizing lost mothers, I got a call from the gallery owner. She sounded breathless. "There's an offer on your auction quilt," she said. "A very generous one. From a buyer in Charleston who collects heirloom textile stories. He wants to display it in a museum alongside other generational American pieces." I paused, my needle hovering mid-air. That quilt, my new quilt, was made of the salvaged scraps from the one they gave to the dog, layered with patches from the Reclaimed Threads project. It was born of pain, of laughter, of every woman who said, "They called this trash, but I made it treasure." "He's offering 65,000, she added, "and he wants to fly you out to speak at the museum." I swallowed hard. 65,000. For the quilt made from what they tried to destroy. I gave her my answer. But it wasn't yes or no. It was, "Let me see it one more time first." That evening, I returned to the gallery where the quilt hung under soft, warm lights. The piece spanned nearly 10 feet wide. Each block was a universe. One had lace from a 1950s wedding dress, another a strip of a firefighter's retired jacket. In the center, a stitched line of golden thread, wrapping through each piece like a quiet spine. Standing there alone, I thought about what it all meant. Not the money. Not the museum. But that thread. The through line that kept showing up, through loss, through betrayal, through being discarded and reclaimed. Me. And suddenly, I knew I didn't want to sell it. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about memory. So I asked the gallery to remove the quilt from sale and instead build a permanent installation in the studio. A place where people could come, sit, and stare. A place to remember who they were, and who they might still become. They agreed. They even offered to fund it. Funny, isn't it? How they once told me that my quilts were nothing but dusty old fabric. And now? Dusty old fabric was drawing citywide grants. 2 weeks later, the family came calling. Again. Only this time, not for forgiveness, but for help. I was alone in my kitchen, slicing apples for a pie crust, when the knock came. Outside stood my daughter-in-law. For the first time in forever, she didn't look smug. She looked tired. Her sweater was rumpled. Her voice trembled. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quietly. We're losing the ranch. The taxes, the mortgage, we can't keep up." She didn't ask me for money right away. But it was written all over her face. The same face that once laughed as the heirloom quilt became the dog's new bed. I invited her inside anyway. Because dignity doesn't mean withholding compassion. It means choosing how, and to whom, you give your energy. She sat across from me at the table, eyes darting around the small, neat kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and sunlight. "I was wrong," she whispered. "We were wrong. About everything." I raised an eyebrow. She went on. "I thought having nice things meant we were better. I thought you were just clinging to the past. But I watched your interview. I've seen what you've built. And I'm sorry." I waited. Then I said, "I believe you." And I did. But when she finally asked, softly, hesitantly, if I'd consider helping with the ranch taxes, I didn't say yes. I said, "No. But I will help you learn how to build something. I'll show you how to start over, like I did. With your own hands." Her face crumpled. Not in anger. In humility. And for once, we sat in silence that didn't hurt. Later that week, my son showed up. This time, he didn't try to justify. He didn't bring excuses or guilt. He brought a sewing kit. A quiet offer. "Teach me," he said. So I did. Every Tuesday evening, he joins me at the studio. At first, his stitches were clumsy. His tension uneven. But slowly, patiently, he found rhythm. He's working on a memory square of his own now. A blue and green patch in honor of his grandmother, stitched with the initials of the great-grandchildren I've barely met. We don't talk about the past much. We just create. Sometimes that's enough. And me? I've started a new quilt. This one is all mine. It's stitched from fabric people tried to erase, stories people tried to silence, and joy that bloomed anyway. In the center, I embroidered a line. "They gave it to the dog. I gave it to the world." That quilt will hang in the studio too. But not under glass. It'll be out in the open for people to touch, to sit beside, to add to if they like. Because healing isn't something we keep hidden. It's something we share. Last Sunday, a local teacher brought her entire class to the studio. 15 teenagers, wide-eyed and curious. They asked me questions like, "What made you start quilting? Did it hurt when they threw it away? What do you say to someone who says you're just being dramatic? And I told them. I say, some people throw away diamonds because they don't like the setting. But the diamond? It's still a diamond. Their eyes lit up. And that's when I knew. This story? It isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to every person who ever had something priceless dismissed. To everyone who stitched themselves back together after being torn down. To anyone who was told their history didn't matter. We are all patchwork. We are all legacy. And sometimes, the final stitch is the one you make just for you.